Hey guys, so let's talk about a new, incredibly fun debut fantasy novel, Kings of the Wyld by Nicholas Eames, published just last week in February by Orbit. This is an epic road trip through the deadly, vicious Heartwyld, a forest filled with all manner of creature, undertaken by what was once this world's greatest band of mercenaries. But that was then, and this is now, and while the bards with their everlasting songs and their timeless stories remember these five men for who they once were and what they once did, the men themselves are neither lasting nor immortal. They've all moved on, for one reason or another, from that old life, and in many ways the world they once knew has moved on from them, and they themselves are older, with the responsibilities and ailments that come with time and life experience. We begin with the bear-like Clay Cooper, also known as Slowhand, wielder of the great shield Blackheart, content at home with his wife and young daughter. He is approached by former bandmate Gabriel, Golden Gabe, once wielder of the great Druin sword Velicor, which, due to some poor choices, is no longer with him, whom Clay hasn't seen in far too long, and to Clay's surprise, Gabe set out to get the old band back together for a mission that's not only crazy, but borderline suicidal. And this time around, though, it's not for the fame, nor the money, and it's not to be heroes, but to save Gabe's daughter Rose, who's trapped far west in a city called Castia that's been overrun by the Heartwyld horde, an assemblage of creatures bent on revenge for the ill treatment they've suffered over countless years. Clay and Gabe must, before it's too late, before Rose is forever lost to the horde, find and recruit the three other ill-fated members of their once great band. Matrix Skulldrummer, who's wielder of the twin daggers Roxy and Grace, who's somehow ended up with a princess the band once saved, and is now the beloved, though scorned by his own wife, now Queen Lilith, king of his own country. Unfortunately, Matrix Life and his wife have not treated him so kindly, and he may be possibly just one assassination attempt away from the one that finally gets him. Then there's the somewhat absurd sorcerer Moog, whom, after the death of his husband Frederick, has been searching years and years for a cure of the fatal rot, which is caught from the prolonged exposure to certain Heartwyld foliage, which killed Frederick. Until that happens, though, Moog's made a living off of what he's called Magic Moog's phallic phylactery, a Viagra-like stimulant of sorts that apparently is quite popular. Not quite the mark he hopes to leave, but there will be plenty of opportunities for a more prestigious legacy soon enough. Then finally, there's Ganelin, a rough, brutal warrior with a giant axe marked by mysterious runes called Syrinx, who's been taken years ago for a crime that he definitely committed, and whom very well may hate the bandmates that left his side all those years ago. If brought together, and that's honestly up in the air at all times, as new and old enemies and friends seem bent on ending the quest before it even begins, they would then face the horrors of the Heartwyld, wherein lies murderous centaurs, hungry cannibals, killer giants, dragons, wyverns, kobolds, chimeras, demons, and much more, just waiting eagerly to rip them apart. Our band of venerable heroes encounters these and much more, including and not limited to the winged succubus harpy-esque Deva bounty hunter called a Larkspur, an Etten, basically a two-headed giant-like creature, a revenant, an all-female band of bandits called Lady Jane and the Silk Arrows that constantly gives our heroes trouble, and the vengeful, derided Druin Lastleaf, master of the Heartwyld horde, whose plans to use that horde to take over Castia may not stop there. We are given in this just a wild ride of fun and excitement, action and adventure, imagination and nostalgic familiarity, emotion and humor, and a glimpse into the gray area of good versus evil. Much about the story is fully straightforward. One thing leads to another, leads to the next thing, leads to another until the end. And it's a book of journeying from place to place with the peoples and beings met with and fought against along the way. The best thing about this book, perhaps not the plot, which is fairly predictable, though always immediate and fast-paced, is the subtle themes introduced throughout. What it means to be a band heavily relates for these characters to what it means to be a family. And it's interesting how that concept of the typical settling down, having a family, is reflected differently in each of the book's main characters. Even the villainous Druin Lastleaf has an interesting part in that exploration, and actually Lastleaf's whole story contributes heavily to our understanding of the different forces forces at work here in this world. The mercenary bands have been around for a while, but recently, to the chagrin of our main characters, what it means to be a band has changed. Much of these young people, these young bands, seem to want nothing to do with the Heartwyld or taking on jobs that involve it. So instead, the cities have set up this sort of constant tournament situation where they keep and breed monsters of the Heartwyld for the mercenary bands to fight and kill on a daily basis. Clay, Gabe, Matrix, Moog, and Ganelin, of course, all see this as just wrong, different, and less honorable than what they've done, but there's a gray area there. Last Leaf represents that group of creatures whose lives mean nothing to these people. Sure, some of their number has wreaked havoc, but is the acceptance of their genocide warranted? There's also themes of these main characters wrestling with their pasts, worrying for their futures, and dealing with both ended and failed relationships that may not have stemmed from the healthiest of places. It's got a lot more going on than originally meets the eye, and a lot of that works because of the characters, creatures, and the conflicts arisen from these opposing viewpoints. And we do read exclusively from the perspective of Clay Cooper, not even the original leader of the band, that was Gabe, but easily the most stable and content nowadays. He knows what's important to him and what he wants from life, and that does not involve being in a band again. But what he does in this book, he does because his friend needs him, because he's a good man, and it shows. At times, especially towards the beginning, some of the relationships, especially the husband-wife relationships, seem entirely cliche and stereotypical, but we do grow to learn and understand specifically the relationship between Clay and his wife, Ginny. I kind of wish we had gotten even more of that, as Clay's reminiscences were incredibly insightful into who he is and what he's been up to all these years. Matrix and his wife, the princess turned queen, just kind of repulse one another, and in no way do we get any sense of what sort of attraction they might have held for each other once. I just wish each of the characters had been given a little more time. Ideally, this would have been best for me had we gotten the chance to see from every one of their perspectives. I'd have loved to see Gabe, Moog, Ganelin, Lastleaf, or Larkspur take the reins. I do understand why Nicholas Eames chose to write it how he did, which is good because it does ground the story in a fairly stable, neutral perspective with Clay Cooper, but in some ways it causes the other characters to lack a certain something only Clay has, despite how fun all of them are to read about. Nicholas Eames does, though, fill this book up to the brim with story. Never dull, never resting. It sweeps the reader off on an adventure, one that's written to feel like you are right there along with your old best friends and reliving the glory days you may now feel are behind you, but that still feel good to have once more. The writing is funny, thoughtful when it needs to be, swift almost always, earnest in its portrayal of these characters and their mission, and respectful of the opposing side whose viewpoints may not be so outlandish as they seem. It's simple writing that does its job well and tells a pretty great story. The world he's built with its many forms of life has just so much potential that it seems we've barely even started to explore it. We see the narrow path this band follows, but not much else on the outside. There's enough there that it feels like a real place, but it's easy to tell there's so much more to be done with what else might be out there. To sum it all up, this was a joy to read and really had me wanting to both pick it up all the time and put it down to make it last longer. Like most great fantasy series, the ones that suit me best, this has its own unique story, self-contained, and will very obviously follow some different but related story in the next book. There's definitely more to see in the plot of this series as a whole, but we've gotten a glimpse at where it all begins. I can easily see this taking what's been built and doing even more with it next time. I definitely recommend this if you're a fan of epic fantasy or sword and sorcery, especially if you like to see old tropes played with and twisted and made new, and if you're a fan of authors like Scott Lynch, Michael J. Sullivan, and Sebastian de Castell. And I think that's pretty much all I have to say about it. Like I said, I enjoyed it, and I hope you'll give it a shot. I would really love more people to read this and weigh in on their opinions. Definitely let me know if you're interested in reading it. I would love to hear about that. If you have come across it and have had the chance to pick it up since its release, I would love to hear any thoughts that you have on it. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you later with more.